Today, I want to introduce this analysis on the confrontation between squatting in Rome and the institutions. So I've been working in the last years over the analysis of the institutionalization or negotiation of practices proposed by the bottom, in particular squatting practices connected to housing movements or social movements, and reappropriation practices by active citizens, mainly in Rome and Berlin. And today I will talk about the case of Rome. So my idea is to start from the analysis of paradigm shift that we are assisting today in the idea of the housing issue into a pandemic times, from a welfare to an health issue. And in this context, for example, in Italy, some of the recovery funds are now intended to be used for increasing public housing intervention. So I want also to quote Renner and Theodore in this case, and saying that specifically in times of crisis, a period of institutional searching and regulatory experimentation ensures in which diverse actors can promote competing hegemonic visions, restructuring strategies, and developmental models. So the goal of the presentation is the analysis of strategies that are addressing the housing crisis in the city of Rome through urban informality, like illegal building and squatting practices. And through that, I would like to, sorry, I have some problem here with the presentation and the Zoom thing. Okay, so I would like to analyze three main questions. That is, which kind of alternative solutions these bottom-up strategies propose during the time, if they have been included and negotiated by institutional actors, if not, why, and finally, also, Okay. Can they be reconsidered as potential pivotal ideas to address housing crisis in this historical moment? So first of all, a few data on this pandemic context. So today, one family over four, it's considered to have a difficulty in paying rent, and 40% of them are expecting to be unable to pay rent in the next 12 months. And the families have accumulated delays in paying rent has increased from 9.6% before the COVID health emergency to 24%. And all this is already a critical situation into a critical situation of the Italian housing issue. In fact, Italy has registered an housing deprivation rate of the 5.6% of the total population. There is almost 1.5 million families, mainly people renting their houses. And today, 650,000 families are waiting for public housing all over the country. This is for sure has also been connected to a neoliberal restructuring of housing system, in which since the end of the 90s, we have assisted to the liberalization of rental market with the abolishment of the rental control law and of the GESCAL fund that was funding the housing sector, and also a big privatization of municipal housing that today consists only of the 4% of the total housing stock in the whole country. And for example, in Rome specifically, just between 1993 and 2006, 155,000 dwellings owned by the city were sold to private corporations. This has made the situation very critical in the city of Rome, that is historically suffering from housing crisis. And we see today 40,000 people suffering from housing distress, composed by people in extreme poverty, migrants under international protection, Roma people in camps, etc. And 12,000 people composed by all these, let's say, weak sectors that are actually occupying today 60 buildings in Rome, and 13,000 families that are in waiting list for public housing. So which kind of alternative solutions during the time these practices have proposed? So in Rome, basically to address to resist this housing deprivation during the time, two main strategies has been developed: the informal city, with the creation of wide areas of informal settlements, and the squatting, with the illegal occupation of public housing, as was introduced by the previous presentation, and of vacant abandoned abandoned building public premises, sorry. So just few numbers. The informal city in Rome have reached very relevant dimension and has been produced by a steady flow of migrants and a chronic shortage of affordable housing. And for this, a big production of housing between 50s and 70s have emerged in the attempt to address the issue of the very degraded peripheral areas. And so a government report at the end of the 70s were actually reporting 830,000 Romans that were living in illegal houses built without any license. This has produced that today 1/3 of the residential urban fabric of Rome are of illegal origin. That is particularly relevant data. And this has been obtained because the institutional response to this wide phenomenon was, first of all, the introduction of condono edilizio law, so a law that was both including this informal settlement into the structural plan of the city and legalizing tenure, and also to overcome the deficiencies in these informal city areas of services. New public housing neighborhoods that were located near these areas were provided of oversized urban standards, the ones that were, for example, also mentioned before talking about Corviale. Most of these urban standards, due to a lack in public investment, became often indeterminate territories and abandoned places that were actually targeted by squatting of many kind. I'd like also to stress that I'm not talking about squatting as its total phenomenon, and I'm focusing on squatting that is enacted by political groups like housing movements. And so analyzing specifically these forms of squatting, the city today has a big reality of squatting of this kind, and about 60 housing squats with involving 2,000 people, that is about 5,000 families, and about 50 occupied self-managed social centers that still exist in the city that have been activated to create spaces for culture, social activities that were actually missing in those peripheral areas of the city. As we can see from this map, the geography of squatted spaces in Rome is still very relevant. In fact, Rome is considered today one of the most occupied cities in Rome. But although that data, today only 12 housing occupations has been legalized throughout the time. I'm still referring to housing movement occupation. And just 8 social centers. Most of the other realities we are seeing are still in a state of illegality. This is just some of the occupation you can find in Rome, from self-managed social centers, cultural centers, urban commons, self-managed public spaces, and housing squats. So throughout the time, the housing movements have worked to give voice to instances like the right to housing, so to self-renovation of abandoned vacant properties, the right to alternative social and cultural spaces, making them entering in the political agenda through conflictive actions. And they have actually built this proposal through a construction of policy discourse, because if we analyze that, we can see how they gone from a practical order, collecting data over housing emergency compared with dramatic lack of affordable housing, with cost-benefit analysis, collecting information and developing real alternatives to budgetary problems for management of public spaces, to reflective order, like the constituent nature of rights, such as right to inhabit, or subsidiarity between formal and informal actors that are both contained in Italian constitution, discussion on the ideological basis of the right to private property, and challenging the idea of illegality versus illegitimacy. Also, the proposals of this three main group of occupations are squatting for housing with the creation of affordable collective spaces for living throughout renovation of vacant cities assets as alternative to housing problems, the self-managed social center with creation of alternative community-based services, and the spaces intended as commons on urban scale that has been a more recent phenomenon with the occupation of theaters and cinemas and public spaces that were are basically intended as alternative to privatization of public assets. So if we see in the Rome issue, the chronic shortage of affordable housing, steady flow of lower class migrants, neoliberal models, state institution that is weak, providing essential services and increasing urban inequalities, has pushed for the activation of urban social movements that have produced alternative forms of urbanity on indeterminate space that which eventually may even stand a chance of altering existing planning prerogatives. So how this has been included by institutional actors and if not why? Well, I want to at this point make a brief analysis on how the confrontation between bottom-up and top-down construction, of discourses. So on one side, in these last decades, bottom-up claims have developed discourses about caution urban renewal, the right to the city, the value of flexible urbanism and participation, urban commons, etc. While on the other side, top-down dominant planning models have been based on revanchist urbanism concept, new urbanism, governmentality, etc. And we can actually discuss how many of them have been triggered or sometimes even influenced, one with the other. This is relevant because I want to discuss on the fact that in this last decades, the understanding of this kind of reclaiming processes have assisted a general shift on three new interpretative frameworks that are basically the criminalization of urban poor and neoconservative security policy, the neoliberal state disinvestment and public pardons privatization, and the urban and governmentalization, urban growth and competitiveness-oriented policies such as creative cities and urban marketing discourses and strategy. This is relevant because if we compare them, we can see that they are actually also influenced by dominant neoliberal urban policies discourses that have been emerging in the last years. If I go to quick to you, okay. So, but also this is true. It is true that these are the elements that have influenced actually the approach of institutions towards this kind of practices. In fact, my previous research of the last years has individuated these three main institutional approach towards these alternative practices. The first one is the selective neglect, in which the state is not capable or not interested in solving the situation of conflict, temporary toleration of illegal condition, of reappropriational practices, for example, is a very common attitude in the city of Rome. And this is why we still can see this big geography of illegal spaces, occupied spaces in the whole city. The second one is the control over space, that is basically implemented to control the size of the phenomenon, that can be divided between repressive strategies and containment strategies that normally take the form of legalization, mostly temporary, and of technical disciplinary normative field. And the last one, integration cooptation, that entails the inclusion of bottom-up strategies in dominant strategies. Among them, we can, for example, talk about temporary uses, as we can see in more applied in northern European countries and cities like Berlin or Paris. And we can say that in Rome, the first 2 points are the mostly adopted for the management of this kind of issues, while the integration cooptation is also being used when the social centers has been legalized with the intention of including them in a system of services for deprived neighborhoods. In this way, let's say, giving to people the management of these services instead of being managed by the institution itself. It is also important to say that in the last year, neoliberal urban policies have, on one hand, managed to hijack and incorporate alternative and self-capture activities, such as squatters, while on the other side also intensifying repressive strategies. And this is mainly because on one side, it was fostered the creation of policies that were including all those aspects that are aligned to neoliberal ideas like community-based services and self-manage of public properties, forms of flexible urbanism and temporary uses, entrepreneurial spirit of citizens, while on the other side was neutralized all the political dimension that was seen as controversial or potentially subverting the basis of liberal values like private property, individuality versus collectivity, utilitarian space, etc., etc. And this is also what made complicated sometimes the interpretation and negotiation of this phenomena for urban planners. This is another analysis I produced over the time. So if we take groups that have produced forms of alternative urbanity in cities, and the claims they've produced along the time, we can see how more the radicality of these claims increase, less the inclusion of those claims happens in terms of development of tools of inclusion of bottom-up proposals. So to finish, if they have been included or negotiated by institutional actors or not, well, this phenomena have been mostly treated as problem of adverse possession in Italy and in Rome specifically. But as we saw, informal settlements are actually being legalized through the introduction of condono edilizio law, while squatting have been kind of regularized with the introduction of two laws that have been produced after moments of great conflicts and riots, but had a very limited effect since the cases on which it's been applied are very few. And I just want to conclude with few observations. So if we analyze that the Italian system is mainly housing system mainly relates to home ownership. In fact, 80% of the population in Italy is homeowner. We can see also how in these decades the public policies has been encouraging home ownership. For example, fostering privatization of public housing or the disinvestment in that sector that today is just 4% of the total housing stock, and creating regional laws like the one that we just saw to legalize informal settlements. And this made the fact that today the rental sector is mostly for poorest and most precarious population. And that makes interesting these last two slides, because I'm here quoting Alessandro Coppola in his analysis on illegal settlements and city, in which he says that the introduction of the law of legalization of these parts of the informal city was one of the played a dramatic role in the almost instant creation of significant financial wealth and the transformation of a big population of the city into actual homeowners. While squatting can be seen instead as a channel to affordable rent. In fact, the problematic reasons for which it hasn't been so far really included, I would say, is first of all budgetary and bureaucratic problems of the city administration. So the only tool that has been individuated so far is the self-renovation law that basically legalize squatting for housing through the creation of a cooperative of inhabitants that can ask for a bank loan in which the city become the guarantor. And that makes that in any moment in which the inhabitants cannot pay, the city has to take the responsibility of the payment. And also it has produced many bureaucratic problems in terms of time that make that so far the experiment has been applied only on 12 cases. And also the fact that these proposals from the bottom are mainly based on rental solution, both because these occupied properties are not intended to be bought from a private owner by the city still for budgetary issues, or sold in the case of a public property, and because this solution proposed to include these renovated spaces into the public housing stock through a rental solution. And but instead, what happened is that in these last years, it has been developed a strategy for housing crisis solution that is based on the creation of residential residence for temporary lodging that are mainly private property on which the city council has to pay a very high rent in order to host temporary family that are suffering from housing emergency. And finally, also for sure, the problem in confrontation with the institution is the subversive dimension of the squatters' proposal that are challenging the idea of property through the act of trespassing and proposing solutions at a zero cost for administration. And also that means zero revenues for private sector. But the interesting part is basically constituted by this kind of zero cost solution that they actually propose. And we can see that, for example, if we analyze again the three proposals, basically the laws that has been proposed, the proposal from the bottom are based on self-construction, that is differentiating from self-renovation, that is the law that now exists, propose a solution based on the not a request of a loan, since most of the squatters are people that come from the are workers in the building sector that can afford to buy a house, and this is a historical issue, and that means that these people are able to build their own house. They're not doing it anymore on pieces of land because that is not possible anymore, but they are able to transform abandoned public building that had other kind of destination, like schools, for example, into housing assets that can become actually part of the public housing assets. And doing so, they actually keep the whole strategy with zero cost for the administration. Also for self-managed social centers, the idea is to increase community-based services spaces with very few costs for the public. That basically is just the renting of the space, as already happened thanks to the law of the 95, to a cooperative of people that can rent the space with the 80% less cost with the rent cost of the market. And that means that the public still gets some revenue from that, but do not have to manage the service for the community. And last, the idea of commons, of reclaimed commons on an urban scale has basically been developed to avoid privatization of public assets that has been increasing in the last years through the implementation of principle of subsidiarity with the state. So proposing the institutionalization of forms of association, as you can see on the case of Teatro Valle Bene Comune, that aim to act as economic partners operating in the management of public assets and services in a third way from public and private sector. And that's all. Thank you.